Great.
And we're back with our candidate, the video sit-downs. We have moved back into the 6th Congressional District. Incumbent Democrat Derek Kilmer is the man on the camera, Derek Allen off camera. Derek is running for U.S. representative in the 6th Congressional District. Derek, first, thanks for coming in and taking some time.
Thanks for having me.
First, let's take a couple of minutes to briefly tell everybody about you, your background, why you're running, and why you feel you're the best candidate.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised on the Olympic Peninsula. My folks were school teachers up in Port Angeles, and when I was in high school, it was right around the time the timber industry took it on the chin, and had a huge impact on my hometown and a huge impact on me. And so I went off to college and graduate school and studied public policy with a focus on economic development, really looking at how do we help communities grow jobs and get more, be more competitive. And then went from there. After graduate school, I worked in business as a consultant for McKinsey & Company for a few years, and then worked professionally in economic development in Tacoma. I worked for a nonprofit called the Economic Development Board that was focused on trying to get more jobs in our area and trying to keep and grow the employers we had. And never thought I'd run for office. I was actually just a grumpy economic developer. I kept finding myself saying, gosh, why is government doing that, and why isn't it doing this? And finally, some of the folks I knew said, you know, you seem to have a lot of good ideas, and you sure as heck complain enough. Why don't you go do something about it? And the next thing I knew, I was serving the state legislature. I worked in that capacity primarily on economic development issues. In my tenure in the state legislature, I was 3 times named the Leader of the Year from the Washington Economic Development Association, and was named a Legislative Business Star from Enterprise Washington's Business Institute for my work on economic development issues. I will tell you, on March the 3rd of 2012, when Norm Dix announced his impending retirement, it wasn't a no-brainer for me to run for Congress. And my wife and I sat down that evening to talk about me pursuing this job. And, you know, like a lot of folks do, we wrote out the pro and the con list. And I'll tell you the top of the pro list, and I'll tell you the top of the con list. Top of the pro list is I think we need to get people back to work. And that's something that I've focused my entire adult life on. Working in business, working in economic development. My service in the legislature was focused on economic development issues. So I feel like, and that's been my focus since I've been in Congress. I was named a champion of Main Street by the Retail Federation for my work on behalf of small businesses. Put forward an economic development agenda for the Olympic Peninsula. So I feel like that's an area where I can make a difference. I'll tell you the 2 things on the con list, the 2 top things on the con list. One, I've got 2 little kids. I've got a 4-year-old named Tess and an 8-year-old named Sophie, and there was some acknowledgement that I was signing up for a 3,000-mile commute. And the second thing was I think Congress is a total mess right now. I don't think you have to watch C-SPAN or read the Washington Post to have a sense that Congress is not firing on all cylinders right now. And yet, as my wife and I sat there staring at our pro and the con list, my eyes kept going to the top of the con list, thinking maybe those are the 2 reasons to do this, because it's a mess. And I've got 2 little kids, and I care about what kind of country they grow up in. And frankly, I do not want their future dictated by a completely messed up federal government. And so that's why I decided to do this. And frankly, the degree to which it's messed up has certainly influenced how I spend my time in Congress. I'm part of a group called the Bipartisan Working Group that meets frequently when we're back in D.C. It's a group of Democrats and Republicans who try to kind of put aside the partisan bickering and figure out how we can solve problems together. And that's really my focus. I think we've got to get past sort of the partisan fighting and focus on progress for the American people.
So what is your position on immigration reform?
Sure. You know, I believe we need to fix our system of legal immigration to make illegal immigration less attractive. And right now, I think, by all accounts, the system is broken. There's a bipartisan proposal for comprehensive immigration reform, and I support that. And for me, that has a few components. First, it means improving border security, certainly at our southern border where we see a lot of challenges, but also at our northern border and in our ports, so that we can be secure in knowing who and what is coming in to our country. That's simply a matter of securing our homeland. But there's 2 other components of comprehensive immigration reform. One is improving the system of immigration for our employers who depend on immigrant labor. And there's a few components of that. One is, right now we have a deficit in some of the high skill fields where employers use H-1B visas. I'm all right within the short term bumping up those numbers of H-1B visas, but I like the bipartisan proposal that says let's jack up the fees associated with doing that and plow those dollars into educating Americans to be able to take on those jobs, improving educational opportunity, particularly in fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. Second, I think we need to improve enforcement of immigration laws within our employer community. Because right now we have employers that are put at a competitive disadvantage because they play by the rules, and that doesn't seem right to me. And then third, I think it's important to have a system of verification in place like E-Verify that ensures that when an employer makes a hiring decision, they know that the person they're hiring is here legally. And then the final component of the bipartisan bill was trying to address this issue of what do you do with the 11 to 12 million people who are currently in our country that lack legal status. And by almost all accounts, it doesn't make sense economically or morally to say let's try to find and deport 11 to 12 million people who are in our country that lack legal status. And so I support the bipartisan proposal that says let's create an earned pathway to citizenship where those folks who are here have to move to the back of the line, have to pay back taxes and fines and penalties, have to pass a background check, have to learn English, and earn their way to citizenship. At the end of the day, we are a nation of immigrants. I'm the son of an immigrant, but we're also a nation of laws, and I think it's well past time that we modernize our laws to keep up with today's reality.
What can be done about ocean acidification and its impact to the shellfish industry?
Well, this is a big deal. When I travel around the district I represent, I hear concerns about this from our fisheries out on the coast. I hear concerns from our shellfish growers here in Mason County and throughout the district. And what's happening here is we're seeing about a quarter of carbon emissions ending up in our oceans, and as a consequence, it's literally changing our ocean chemistry, and it means we're literally seeing shellfish growers having to move some of their operations because oysters aren't growing properly and they're not able to successfully harvest. And so I've already gone to work on this as the representative for this area. I've introduced a bill called the Ocean Acidification Innovation Act. It's a bipartisan bill. I was joined by Jamie Herrera Butler, who represents the district to our south, in trying to move this forward. And what it does is it says, let's try to get more federal attention and more federal research going into trying to solve this very hairy problem. I mean, part of the challenge is we actually don't know exactly how this is playing out. And exactly what we can do to mitigate the impacts of it. And so historically, what our nation has generally been doing is it said let's provide grants to researchers to figure this out. What our bill does is it says rather than say giving a $5 million grant to a researcher, we're saying if you set up and there's been evidence that this works in other phases of government, let's set up in essence a prize competition where rather than providing a $5 million grant, you provide a $5 million prize. And what experience tells us is that means you'll get a lot of leverage. You'll get $20 to $50 million of investment from private researchers from universities in trying to solve this problem. The other element of this that I've been working on is working with our neighboring Congressman Denny Heck in standing up what's called the Puget Sound Recovery Caucus to try to drive more federal attention and more federal resources into protecting our waters that are not just important environmentally but important to our economy.
Where do you stand on stricter regulations for firearms?
Well, I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment. I want to make sure that responsible gun owners, whether they own their guns for hobby or for home protection or for hunting, don't see laws that infringe on their rights. At the same time, as I talk to gun owners, as I talk to folks in law enforcement, I do think that there are some common sense things that we can do. I do not think it makes sense to allow people who are dangerous felons or who have dangerous mental illness to be able to get their hands on a firearm. And so I'm supportive of the bipartisan proposal that says let's have enhanced universal background checks, with some carve-outs for family members and things like that. I think that makes sense. I think part of the thing that's been missing in this conversation is a greater focus on mental health issues. I mean, the common denominator in all of these substantial issues of gun violence has been mental illness. And as I travel around the district, there's a lot of concern that within our communities and within our society, we're not putting an adequate focus on addressing mental health problems. And that's been something, as the representative for this area, that I've already gone to work on.
What do you think the size and duties of the U.S. military should be?
Well, this has been something I spent a lot of time on. When in my service in the Congress, I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and I was actually just named a co-chair. I'm part of what's called the New Democratic Coalition, which is basically a group of moderate, pro-growth Democrats, and I was just named the co-chair of their National Security Task Force. The fact is, there are threats out there that exist, and so it's important, in my view, that we have a strong military, and I think it's important that we have the strongest military in the world. At the same time, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff has testified that one of our threats to our national security is our national debt. And he has testified that the Department of Defense can and should be part of addressing our nation's debt challenges. And so there are some areas where I think the Department of Defense can find some savings. Certainly, as we draw down, we've already drawn down in Iraq. As we draw down in Afghanistan, there will be some savings. But there's a few things that I've been working on as the representative for this area. One is procurement reform, acquisition reform within our military, trying to get to a point where when our Department of Defense buys things, it buys in a more efficient way. And just actually in the National Defense Authorization Act that we just passed, I was able to get some language focused specifically on some of the IT procurement the Defense Department does. Rather than having them develop everything in-house, trying to look at commercial off-the-shelf solutions that are often better technologically, but also substantially cheaper for taxpayers. Also looking at not just how we buy things, but what we buy. I mean, too often, Congress is proposing buying stuff that the Department of Defense says it doesn't need, or that doesn't make sense. I was just a very strong advocate, or a very strong opponent of a proposal to spend $550 million buying helicopters from Russia to send to Afghanistan. I do not think it makes sense to send $500 million over to Russia right now. I was an opponent of a plan to spend over $70 million on an East Coast-based missile defense system that the Department of Defense says it doesn't want, and that won't work. So part of this is trying to be smarter about what we buy as well. There's one more component of this, though, that I think bears mention, and that is, we need to have a strong military because evil exists, and there's threats that exist. Generally speaking, when you're talking about a substantial reduction in defense spending, it's usually coinciding with a sense that we're substantially safer as a nation, and I think it's very hard to walk your way around the globe and come to the conclusion that we're substantially safer. But the important thing that I'll mention is while we need to have a strong military, not every problem can be solved with a bomb and a tank. I support what the Department of Defense refers to as smart power, the notion that you need to have a strong military, but there's other tools in our foreign policy toolbox. My dad always used to say, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But there's other tools in our foreign policy toolbox, things like economic policy, sanctions. We're using sanctions right now in North Korea and Iran and in Syria. That's a tool in our foreign policy toolbox. Foreign assistance is a tool in our foreign policy toolbox. Trade, as you see an effort to try to enhance trade opportunities along the Pacific Rim, and that's not just an economic strategy. That's if we make ourselves more interdependent economically, that doesn't just help us sell American stuff to other parts of the world. It also makes us more interdependent from a security standpoint, and makes it much less likely that those nations are going to cause us trouble. Diplomacy is one of those tools in our foreign policy toolbox, and I think the challenge of the 21st century is finding the right tool to fit the right foreign policy problem.
Moving to another topic, are
Sure.
you in favor of increasing the minimum wage? If so, how would you propose about going about raising that wage without having to lessen the impact on small
Sure.
business?
Yeah, I spent a decade working in economic development. I worked in economic development in Tacoma, and in that capacity, I met with about 200 businesses a year, and so I'm always very focused on how we can grow opportunities and grow our economy. Where I've been engaged in this conversation is in the proposal that's been put forward in the Congress, which is to gradually, over a 3-year period, increase the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. And I'm supportive of that proposal. And for me, I'm supportive of it for a few reasons. One, right now, for those states that are pegged to the federal minimum wage, if you're working 40 hours a week at the federal minimum wage, you're making about $15,000 a year. And for a family of 3, that means you're living under the poverty line. And I just think if you're working full-time, it's not right for someone to be living in poverty. Second, I want to see us have a system where people are inclined to work rather than be on welfare. And for me, that means you actually have to have a system where work pays more than welfare. Third, part of the reason you see a lot of small businesses actually support this proposal to increase the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour is the notion that it's kind of the Henry Ford notion that he wanted the people who worked for him to actually be able to afford the product that they make. Interestingly, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the federal proposal to increase the federal minimum wage not only reduces poverty, it actually grows the economy, because it means there's more dollars in the pockets of Americans and of working families that they can go spend on Main Street here in Mason County. So that's, to me, one of the selling points of this. And then finally, the other thing I'll add is, if we're able to increase the federal minimum wage, there's some benefit to our state competitively as a state that has one of the higher minimum wages, if not the highest minimum wage. That'll level the competitive playing field for Washington State vis-a-vis some of these other states. And so I'm supportive of the proposal in the Congress, and I'm hopeful that we'll get it passed.
Now, speaking of wages, during the recent government shutdown, you gave some of your wage back, is that correct?
Yeah, I was deeply against the government shutdown. I think this is part of the reason Congress is held in lower regard than head lice and colonoscopies. I mean, having worked in economic development, you would never see a successful business say, well, when we have a management disagreement, we're just going to shut down for a few weeks. I was also very concerned, when you've got workers at the Naval Shipyard or park rangers who aren't drawing a paycheck because Congress can't do its job. I didn't think it was right for me as a representative of this area to draw my paycheck. So I gave my salary back during the shutdown. I'm a strong proponent of leading by example, and for me that meant something during the shutdown. The other thing, though, I'll mention is I've taken it a step further, and I've proposed something that is a little bit controversial in our nation's capital. It's a bill that's very simple. It's called No Budget, No Pay. And it says if Congress can't do its job and pass a budget, then members of Congress shouldn't get paid. I'm for that. I've never had a job since I was a teenager working at Westside Video in Port Angeles, where I got paid for a job that didn't get done. And if you look at, one of the fundamental jobs of Congress is the power of the purse to actually pass a budget and to make sure that we have a nation that's navigating our long-term fiscal health. And so I'm a proponent of that bill, and I hope we can get it passed.
Last question for you, Derek. How do you plan to represent all areas of your district, especially the smaller, less populated areas?
Sure. Well, particularly as someone who grew up on the Olympic Peninsula, I'm proud of the approach that I've taken as the representative for this district. I think too often as you look at our nation's capital, there's a sense that, whether it be special interests or deep pockets are kind of running the show. And I think democracy works best when representatives are responsive to the people they represent. Democracy should be governed by we the people. And so that's really affected the approach I've taken in this job. And I'll give you some examples. I've done, since in the year and a half that I've been in office, I've done 16 in-person, open to the public town hall meetings throughout the district I represent, all over the district I represent. I've done 6 telephone town halls where we call to every county in the district I represent, and people can join in and and we have literally thousands of people who participate in these telephone town halls. I've visited, I think, 17 chambers of commerce throughout the district I represent. I think 17 Rotary clubs, again, in every county in the district I represent. I've been to over 100 community events throughout the district I represent. I'll be, whether it be at Allen Days or down here at Oyster Fest in Shelton, all over the district I represent, because I think it's important as a representative to be available and accessible and accountable to the people I work for. But the other element of that is it's also impacted my policy focus in this job. I'll give you some examples. I've introduced something called the Olympic Peninsula Economic Development Initiative. That's a series of proposals that's focused on trying to grow economic opportunity on the Olympic Peninsula and in the rural parts of the district I represent. It's things like, we stood up a timber collaborative, which is an opportunity to try to increase harvest levels in our federal forests. It's getting the environmental community and the timber industry around a table together to try to advance this effort and increase harvest levels and increase economic opportunity within the timber industry in our rural communities. We've got proposals dealing with everything from infrastructure investment to trying to help our ports, to trying to expand workforce development opportunities and educational and training opportunities in our rural communities. Trying to help manufacturers in rural areas, because I want to make sure that we're building stuff and making stuff in America again. I don't want, for our rural communities, I don't want our top export to be our kids. And it's included also one of the issues we already talked about, which is trying to address this issue of ocean acidification, which is a big deal in the rural parts of my district, for our fisheries and for our shellfish industry. And so that has been a big focus for me as the representative of this area, not just to spend my time, but to also spend my mental energy and to invest our policy work in trying to help the rural parts of the district. And so I'm proud to represent this area. I want to continue representing this area, and I hope that the viewers will renew my contract. I certainly ask for their vote.
Okay, Derek Kilmer, incumbent Democrat, 6th Congressional District U.S. Representative. Thank you for taking some time.
You bet, my pleasure.